I find myself, as I do so often in my trade, talking to a room full of people who know much more about the subject I'm speaking about than I do. It's an occupational hazard as a generalist. I am, however, in the persuasion business, and I've given some thought to what kinds of arguments work, not just in this area, but in other things. So I thought I might share with you some thoughts in that regard. It might just stimulate your own thinking, of course, and dealing with the many myths and misconceptions that are out there, and indeed the level of profound ignorance that is out there. I should say it's a lot better than it was. I can remember 10 years ago, I think it was, the Ontario referendum on mixed member proportional, and the level of discourse then, especially including amongst my media colleagues, was really quite extraordinarily bad. And there is a rising level of literacy around this subject, I think, and I think it's very much to the credit of your organization and your hard work. And indeed, we meet now in propitious times. Only a few months ago, electoral reform was supposedly dead after the spectacular backflip by Justin Trudeau. I think the greatest broken promise since Zap You're Frozen. Some of the older members will remember. And I cannot overstate what a remarkable breach of trust that was. You know, we keep going through this in our country with, not just on this issue, but on a range of issues where people get elected on very specific promises. I don't mean slips of the lip or, you know, item 29 in a footnote somewhere, but central campaign promises. And then they get into office and do the exact opposite. And they do it so often, and there's such skepticism out there, that we now get into this cycle where they have to make the promise even more explicit and even more binding and even more unequivocal, and then break it again. So you could not have had a more unequivocal black letter promise than that Liberal promise on this. It was designed to make clear that they really meant it this time. And they didn't. And of course, it was all because we, the Canadian public, did not form a consensus in the absence of any leadership whatever on this. And I think back and I imagine, you know, how would we have brought in Medicare, or how would we have brought in free trade if these big ideas had to wait until somehow magically a consensus formed out there without anybody getting out in front and leading and forging that consensus? However, as we've seen, mercifully, the issue has not died, and in fact is very much alive in a number of quarters. We saw, of course, what was it, a couple months ago, the referendum in PEI. I imagine you'll be talking about that. 52% in favor of mixed member proportional, if memory serves. That has certainly put it very much on the landscape. We'll see what happens. Maybe people can tell me what's going to happen with the Premier having said it wasn't a high enough threshold. People always find reasons to reject proportional representation after it's been. We saw this in BC as well, but that's certainly a beacon of hope. We had just recently, a couple weeks ago, in London, Ontario, the first jurisdiction anywhere in Canada to move to anything other than first past the post. They've adopted a ranked ballot. Now I know ranked ballots are not PR, and I also know there's a bit of history over this issue. So let me just lay my cards on the table here. I think the biggest enemy of reform is the status quo, and I'm going to come back to this later when we talk, is this assumption that a lot of people have out there that there is only one system. We are unique, my friend Dave Meslin tells me, we are unique in being the only first past the post country that has first past the post at every level of government. So people in this country are completely unaware that there are such other systems, or if they are, it's in strange, far-off places with strange ways of doing things. So just to have a system that is not first past the post, in my opinion, moves the yardsticks. It opens the possibilities. It opens the idea that there are other alternatives are available to us. And of course, thirdly, we have this situation in British Columbia. Now, I don't want you to get your hopes up too high just yet, because there's a lot of innings still to play in British Columbia. I don't know, are there any British Columbians here today? Yeah. So you know that this is a complicated situation. There's this whole question of, you know, can they elect a speaker, and if they do, then they lose their majority. Wait and don't get your hopes up just yet. It's not entirely clear whether they're going to be able to form a government. If they are, if they're going to be able to pass legislation, and if they do, then of course we get into the whole question of what is the process there. They've agreed there should be a referendum, which was a concession by the Greens. But there's a lot of questions still to be answered about. And people who fixate on this, well, one thing we know is it has to be a referendum. I think there's a lot of other questions that then raises. Questions like, when do you have the referendum? And I think there's a very good case to be made that you could have a referendum after the fact rather than before, so that you're comparing a known with an unknown rather than a known with a known rather than supposedly this great leap into the dark. Secondly, there's the question of what do you put on the ballot? And I'm of the school that says I don't see why you have status quo versus some new proposal where the default, if it doesn't pass, is you stay with the status quo. I'm not sure the status quo gets a buy into the final, if you will. I don't see any reason why it can't be, if it's going to be on the ballot at all, why it can't be an option among others. And in fact, at the federal level, if they had gone ahead, I think you would have had a very strong case to make that it shouldn't be on the ballot at all, that Liberals had run and won a mandate. They hadn't won a mandate for any particular reform, but they had won a mandate that it shouldn't be the status quo. And of course, you get the question of what should be the voting method on the referendum. And I think if you're going to have multiple choices, it's a very strong case that it should be a ranked ballot. Well, you put all that together, it's the PEI model. I think PEI maybe overdid it a little. 5 options on the ballot is maybe taxing people's patience and their ability to follow these things. But 3 options, I think, makes perfect sense. So, as I say, keep your fingers crossed that things play out in favor of PR and BC in some way or another, but it may not be absolutely immediately. Well, as I say, let me just talk about, since the game is still very much afoot, let's talk a little bit about the art of persuasion. I find with any proposal, leave aside proportional representation, any proposal for changing anything runs up against the insuperable objection that this would mean changing things. You may have run into this yourself. And indeed, you know, I can see the reasoning for that. We live in a very fortunate country. We're doing pretty darn well in this country compared to virtually any other place on earth. And there's a strong feeling of, well, you know, why do we want to rock the boat? And what you'll often hear, of course, I'm sure you've heard, is what is the problem this is trying to solve? Isn't this just a solution in search of a problem? And of course, that ancient bit of cornpone wisdom, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I should probably give that a southern accent. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, yes, it's a very good argument if it ain't in fact broke. The problem, of course, is that our democracy is not working as it should. And if you're trying to persuade people, the thing I always find is the first step is to try to find agreement on the ends, agreement on the objective, if you're trying to persuade them of your particular means to that objective. And people like democracy. People want to live in a democracy. People think we live in a democracy. And so it is something that I think you have to sort of tenderly disabuse them of, that, yeah, we're not living in a dictatorship. Nobody's going to knock on your door in the middle of the night and take you away. But in important ways, we don't quite have a fully functioning democracy in this country. And if you ask people, well, how would you define a democracy? What is the sort of the core ideas behind democracy? Well, the first thing many people will say is, well, it's a system of majority rule. Well, that's not the system we have, as you well know, in this country. We don't live under a system of majority rule. We live under a system of institutionalized minority rule. It only takes a plurality in each riding to win an election. It only takes a plurality of the vote, typically, to win in the aggregate. This is I submit, not a trivial objection. People will sometimes sort of wave that away of, well, yeah, minorities, yeah, so what? Well, we as a people have a pretty, innate sense of majority rule. And the proof of that, I submit to you, is the way we have votes in Parliament. If you tried to pass legislation in Parliament with 39% of the MPs I submit to you there would be riots in the streets. People get it, that it has to be a majority of the MPs. They don't seem to connect the fact that those majority of the MPs don't actually represent anything except the funhouse mirrors of first past the post. But if you could connect the two, that in fact, that same principle that says it has to be a majority of the MPs is basically arguing it should be a majority of the population represented, and I think you start to get some traction. Well, secondly, you say, well, what else does democracy mean? Well, it means a system in which every vote is equal. Everybody gets a vote, and every vote counts equally. But again, as you would well know, that's not the system we have in Canada. We have a system in which some votes count for multiples of others, depending on which riding you're in and how the vote splits and which party you voted for, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I would say, do the thought experiment. Supposing we handed out not one vote to each person, but we handed out sheafs of them to some people. We gave 29 votes to you, and 2 votes to you, and 1 to you, and 13 to you. That, again, I think would cause riots in the streets. People would see the injustice of that. But again, as with the votes in Parliament, we have the form but not the substance. Everybody does, in fact, get one slip of paper. They just don't have any effective equality in their voting weight. But if you can make it clear to people what's really going on, I think it will prick their democratic consciences, if you will. Well, a third thing you say to people is, well, you know, how do you define democracy? Well, you get to vote for the party of your choice. That's a functioning, you know, fundamental aspect of democracy is you have a number of competing parties and you can freely choose which of those parties you prefer. But that's not the system we have in Canada, in which people are routinely told you cannot vote for the party of your choice. You have to vote for a party you dislike to keep a party you detest from getting into power. And people, this is a real factor in election after election, is that you cannot waste your vote, quote unquote, on a party that can't win. You're just going to split the vote. You've all heard these arguments. Or indeed, if you are not voting for the winning party, as I have not in my entire voting career, I think I have an unbroken record of trudging to the polls every single time, knowing that it was entirely futile. So no, we don't really have a system in which every vote counts equally or that you can vote for the party of your choice. And of course, we've seen, I don't need to rehearse for you, all the consequences at election time of these multiple distortions, that it exaggerates the vote of parties that can clump their vote geographically to the disfavor of parties that have more evenly spread support, and so on and so forth. As I say, I feel funny kind of even rehearsing these arguments for it because you're very familiar with them. All I would say is, as important, and we can go into those if you like, but as important as all of those traditional arguments for proportional representation are, they don't ultimately do it. They're not enough. I can get people part of the way with these arguments about the equality of the vote, about getting rid of strategic voting, et cetera, but it doesn't do it in the end. And I think one reason is, I'll give sort of several things I think need to be added to that, but one reason is people fundamentally don't care as much about what happens on election day as what happens every day in between. It's how they're going to be governed that really gets people's attention. They can kind of listen to you about the ridiculousness of what happens in the elections, but it's really what happens afterwards that I think for many people they can connect to. And so I think there has to be more emphasis placed upon the incentive structure, if you will, of this kind of voting system. The voting system in any election, in any democracy, is the way we keep score. It's the system of rewards and penalties for different types of behavior. And the parties are acutely conscious of this, not just on election day, but every day in between. So the particular incentive structure that first past the post, winner-take-all voting, has for them is very important to consider. It's a highly leveraged system, is one way to put it. When only a 2% swing in the popular vote can lead to 60, 70, 80 seat swings in your representation in Parliament, that's a highly leveraged system. Well, one consequence we've seen, and is well documented in the literature, of course, is the phenomenon of policy lurch, that small changes in the popular vote lead to these wild, absurd swings in the policies that are enacted because parties get in and get out, not on the basis of major shifts in public opinion in one direction or another, but just because of the accidents of the split votes. If you live in Ontario, you're acutely aware of this. In the space of 5 years, in the early 1990s, as one example, we went from the David Peterson Liberals to the Bob Rae New Democrats to the Mike Harris Tories in the space of 5 years. It was a bit of whiplash. That is something that I think gets people attention does that make a whole lot of sense to be making these enormous changes in policy? Revolutions brought in, revolutions erased in the space of a few years just because of a few changes in the vote. That leverage, that winner-take-all aspect of it also does strange things to politicians' brains, I think. You'd be strange, too, if you were living on that kind of knife edge all the time. And I think part of the reason we see these long periods of stasis in our politics where nobody takes any chances, nobody goes out on a limb, everybody hugs the middle, and then at election time you get this sudden explosion of gewgaws and wedge issues, et cetera. I think that has something to do with it, that everyone's very concerned that if I take too much of a risk, I lose that 2% of the vote, I'm going to experience a major drop in my parliamentary representation. On the other hand, if I bet right, get just the right wedge issue, I could win it all. So it encourages a kind of a strange kind of sometimes risk-averse, sometimes reckless risk-taking type of politics. It also, of course, encourages this very nasty, negative, personal attack type of politics because it's all about mobilizing the base. If you get 40% hardcore and the others split the vote, then you're in like Flynn. Well, that has its own, as I say, its own incentive effects, its own perverse dynamics. And of course, one of the things we're really seeing in recent times in Canada is even the vaunted stability of first past the post. A lot of people say, well, say what you will. Yeah, I get that it has all these problems, but it delivers stable majorities. It's not doing that anymore. We had 9 of the last 20 federal elections have been minority parliaments. First past the post delivers stable majorities in two-party systems. We haven't had two-party politics at the federal level since 1921. Eventually, I think people will get it that this is not Sir John A.'s parliament anymore. This is a very different model, and first past the post really doesn't work in that model. So we're now getting a choice, in other words, between unstable minority parliaments, unstable because they're first past the post and because everyone's got their finger over the button because they think a 2% swing in the vote means we get to win it all next time. So everyone's waiting to force an election. People equate minority parliaments with proportional representation in entirely different situations. So we swing between these unstable minority parliaments and unrepresentative majority. That's our choice these days. I think you can start to get people's attention. If you talk about how it affects our politics and the way we're governed in the time in between elections. But that still is not going to be enough, I think, for a lot of people. And the reason, as I alluded to earlier, is there is a remarkable, profound lack of awareness of the alternatives to first past the post. Because, as I say, most people in this country have only ever have any knowledge of that one system. They're barely aware that other systems exist, and if they are, they have these very stereotyped and caricatured ideas of how they actually work. And what I found in particular are the kind of unspoken assumptions that a lot of people that you talk to have is, and it sounds absurd to say it, but I really do think it's at the core of a lot of the way sometimes the arguments go in circles where you feel like you're talking past each other. One is there's a strong unspoken or unexamined belief that proportional representation means no local representation, that you get rid of ridings or something like that, or just that there's some kind of fundamental incompatibility between the two ideas of proportional representation and local representation. And the second, somewhat connected idea is that the only way to achieve local representation is by single-member plurality riding systems, i.e. the system we have now. they assume, in other words, what they seek to prove. And a lot of the arguments that you'll hear, or the lines that you'll hear, a lot of the exasperated sighing and the eye-rolling, and there's a couple of Ottawa pundits I have in mind that you may be familiar with, who will say things that, when you raise certain objections to it, well, that's not how our system works. Or they'll say, there's not supposed to be a relationship between the popular vote and the number of seats you get. It doesn't work that way. We have 338 separate ridings, in case you weren't aware. This is just the complaint of sore losers. Well, if you unbundle those exasperated, eye-rolling arguments, for want of a better word, what's at core with that is this idea that the system we have is the only system there is. Now, I grant you, if that were the case, if the only system that were possible to have was single-member plurality, then it would be a silly objection to say that second and third place candidates weren't elected or that their votes weren't counted. That would absolutely be the complaint of sore losers. And to talk about wasted votes, et cetera, all that would be true. If that was the only system it was possible to have, and if the only way to achieve local representation was by single-member plurality, if proportional representation really did mean getting rid of local representation, I probably wouldn't be for proportional representation in a country like Canada. We're a huge spread-out country. We're not going to have a system like Israel or the Netherlands where the whole country is one electoral district. No one would propose that, certainly not me. But mercifully, of course, that is not the only system it is possible to have. But this is the point, I think, that is really at the nub, I've just come to the conclusion, of the whole argument. The fundamental choice when it comes to PR versus first past the post, I think, comes down to, do you want to have single-member ridings or multi-member? Every system, as you're aware, every system of proportional representation in some way, shape, or another has to have multi-member districts, whether it's through multi-member proportional, whether through STV or these various other models, because that's how you get the proportionality. Now, that's a radical idea for a lot of people. It was even for me. It seems a bit strange to think about multi-member ridings until you think about it for a while, and then it doesn't seem so strange. And I found that people's resistance to it has gone down over time. It doesn't sound quite so wacky and out there as it might have in the past. And particularly when you start to exchange with them and you say, if you can have multi-member ridings, still have local representation, just multi-member ridings, why wouldn't you? If you don't have to give all the representation in a riding to one person or one party, if you can share it out and by that, so doing, have a more representative sampling of the population in that riding, why wouldn't you? And there's small arguments people make about, well, who do I go to if I've got a complaint? And you can deal with those arguments about how that would change in a functional way. I don't think they're insuperable arguments at all. But that fundamentally is the change. And why I think it's important to emphasize that, and this is maybe the biggest point I want to leave you with, is I think the case for proportionality has to be built from the ground up, from the riding level up. If you just talk about, oh, look, the Greens got 10% of the vote and they only got one seat, at the aggregate level, I think a lot of people's eyes glaze over. And I think you're vulnerable to the that's not how our system works type of complaint. It sounds sort of like there's some kind of statistical jiggery-pokery that's going to go on where somebody in a back room somewhere is going to reapportion these things, and people don't like the sound of that. But if you talk about, well, let's talk about proportionality at the riding level. Right? Let's say you've got 5-member ridings, roughly speaking. I know this isn't exactly accurate, but roughly speaking, if you get 20% of the vote, you get 1 of the 5, and if you get 40% of the vote, you get 2 of the 5. People get that, I think, because it's at the riding level. And then you just simply say, well, proportionality in the whole is simply the aggregate of the proportionality of the parts. Then I think people go, okay, I get that. You didn't meet somewhere and reassign the votes and do something I don't trust. It's simply just built out of proportionality at the riding level. Now, that will suggest to you that I tend to favor STV type of models. And if that's a big debate, I lean in that direction, partly for that reason. I think it's intuitively easier to explain to people. But secondly, anytime you start talking about lists, And I know it's unfair. Most of the objections to lists are not accurate, but nevertheless, it's a hard case to make. I've found it oftentimes people have it as a stumbling block. So I think, as I say, building proportional representation from the ground up, from the riding level up, as a way of explaining, I think, has a lot of merit to it. The final point I'll just make is you can make all the theoretical and principled and logical arguments that you want, but fundamentally, you've got to argue from facts. Again, because people are so unaware that we're not the only country on Earth, that this isn't the only system on Earth. This, by the way, happens in every debate in Canada. Healthcare. We're aware of the Canadian system. We're dimly aware of the American system. We think those are the two choices. There's 1,000 other choices. France, Switzerland, Italy. We know every country is wrestling with this, and some are doing better than others. Very similar, obviously, with electoral systems. So just getting people aware of how it actually works in other countries, because at the bottom, again, of a lot of these objections and arguments is this unspoken fear that we're doing this for the first time. That if we do this, we're leaping off into some completely unknown adventure, that nobody's ever done this. Right? It's absolutely at the bottom of a lot of the concerns that are raised, is people are just unfamiliar. So just explaining, some basic facts. So to take, for example, our beloved Prime Minister's objection, that this is going to lead to small extremist parties taking over. Yeah, you can make the logical argument. You can work through the type of scenario that has to hold for that actually to be the case, that there has to be, almost exactly equal numbers of seats between the two major parties. Wait a minute, I'm describing BC right now under first past the post. But you have to have almost exactly, and then everybody has to absolutely vote the party line. Nobody crosses the floor or departs from the thing. And most important, of course, that none of the parties, large or small, pays any price for their behavior. So that if some mainstream party does a deal with the Nazis, that somehow they don't pay any price at the next election for that because there are no more elections or something. So there's these scare scenarios about where we'd be giving over to the Nazis control. So you can make all the logical arguments, is my point. But I think you really need to do is just unbundle the facts on it. And I went and looked at the numbers on this. If you look at the proportion of the vote that goes to the quote-unquote fringe parties in Canada, outside of the big five, let's say, you add them all together, and they don't add up to 1% of the vote. Together. If you look at the riding level, the number of them that ever get more than 1% of the vote at the riding level, very small. If you get 3%, you're down to maybe 5 or 6 candidates that get 3%. Now, I know if you change the voting system, everything changes. People might be more inclined to vote for parties if they didn't feel they were just throwing away their vote. Fine, okay, so supposing their vote doubles, or supposing it triples, or supposing it quadruples. Now, let's say that they multiply their vote by 5 times. They get up to 15% of the vote. That's still short of the quota you would need under a 5-member riding system. So the number of Nazis that are going to get elected because we changed the electoral system, I would submit to you, is vanishingly small, unless you think that, we changed the electoral system and Canadians just turn into Nazis. So it's a ridiculous thing, just simply looking at the facts. And similarly, if you look around at the countries around the world, very well-governed countries around the world that use PR, you find that they score very highly on fiscal levels in terms of their debt levels. They score very highly in terms of levels of income, in terms of social well-being, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at how many elections they are in countries with PR, they're no more frequent than our elections. If you look at, how likely are they to throw the bums out? This is one of the classic arguments that's made. At least we can throw the bums out in the first past the post system. I went and looked at this. Let me just see if I got the numbers here. Well, first of all, in Canada, we've had some of the longest lasting dynasties in the democratic or indeed the undemocratic world. The 42-year reign of the Conservatives in Ontario, the 43-year reign of the Conservatives in Alberta, the near century-long dominance of the federal Liberals. This is not a system where we have actually done a really good job of throwing the bums out. And yet, if you look at some other countries, yeah, you find some countries like Austria or Germany where they've only thrown the bums out 3 or 4 times, or Sweden 6 times since 1945 compared to Canada's 8 times. So yeah, those are fewer than we have federally. But the citizens of Norway have thrown the bums out 9 times in the same period. The Danes have done it 12 times. And the Irish have thrown the bums out 13 times. So there's no particular tendency for first past the post to make the firm smack of authority of throwing the bums out. Let me just close by saying what we're fundamentally talking about, I'm sure we're all agreed here, is really a change of philosophy more than anything. It's really about what do we think elections are about? Are they just intended to find out who won, or are they to find out what people think? Is the only possible form of parliamentary democracy single-member plurality, or can we talk about several members per riding? Do we only allow a slice of the electorate to be represented in Parliament, or can we have that broader representation based on the actual range of views in the country? And I'll just close by saying it's striking to me, to come back to the question of the referendum, it's striking to me how many opponents of electoral reform seek refuge in the referendum. And good for them. I don't have any objection to referendums. But why did they do that? Well, why would you be able to have a mandate to bring in electoral reform just because you won an election because you only got 39% of the vote? You will actually hear people say this. You can do everything else with 39% of the vote, but God forbid you should change the electoral system. And so what they want is a referendum. Why do they want a referendum? Because you have to get a majority in the referendum, and because every vote counts equally. Everybody gets a vote. It's really quite striking, isn't it? Anyway, I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll take any questions you may have if you've got time. You have time for questions? Or have I used up my time? Maybe I've used up my time. But I'm easy either way.
They're lining up.
I'll try. Let's keep both the questions and the answers short because we probably want to get on to the next session. But go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
It's fabulous. And I mean, I was won over well before I came into here. So what I'm really looking for is an answer that I can give to the people who raise objections to me about PR. And specifically, one of the arguments I've heard, and I'm having a tough time rebutting it, is, well, under PR, it all goes towards the mushy middle.
Right. And
you don't get policy innovation. For example, if we had had PR in Saskatchewan, would Tommy Douglas have been able to bring in Medicare?
Right.
You do sometimes need sort of a jump in the paradigm to be able to introduce something big, society-changing. And if it's all rushed to the middle and the parties are all negotiating away with one another, how do you achieve that?
Well, of course, the first thing we note about that is the opposite complaint to the extremist fringe takeover. And you notice this with a lot of these arguments is some people will say it needs to revolving door parliaments, where the governments come and go, and then some people say, no, it leads to permanent governments of entrenched insiders you can never get rid of. So people do need to kind of choose which one they mean. Again, I don't think that actually conforms with the experience I see of PR. So again, people make differing arguments, but the common objection, of course, is that you'll see 29 parties in the parliament. In fact, if you look around Europe, for example, it's typically 6 to 8, again, depending on the particular model chosen. But in any model that's likely to be similar to ours, 6 to 8. We have 5. Britain right now has 11. And what there typically is a broader range, actually, of opinions. Not all mushy middle. We have the mushy middle. We have the Tories and Liberals hugging the center for 100 years. But you typically get 2 constellations of parties, one left of center and one right of center. Yeah, you typically have 1 or 2 brokerage parties, center right, center left. But then you get these kind of ideas parties that can kind of, they form part of coalitions. They don't get to do everything they want, but they're at least able to talk about their ideas and inject them into the conversation. So yes, it does mean that you can't just get 40% of the vote and then launch a revolution. So yeah, in that sense, it's harder to get things done. But it means you've got to make your gains by the earned increments of persuasion rather than by the accidents of split votes. So yeah, you actually have to convert people to your cause. It maybe takes a little longer. I don't accept that it means you can't make changes. You look around these countries, they're making big changes depending on the situation, but you have to actually assemble a real majority rather than a fake one. So no, I don't think it all converges on the mushy middle. There might be a fairer objection about ranked ballots on their own, but proportional representation, I think, makes more room for ideas-based parties on the right and the left. And just one other point is, a lot of conservatives are very concerned about this. They think it means the end, they'll never be in power again. Because, you know, right now the Liberals and the NDP can split the vote and they can get in. First of all, of course, when you change the electoral system, you change everything. Parties, voting strategy, electoral strategies change, voters' calculus changes. But what I think you'd also see is you'd see an emergence of one or two more conservative parties. And my observation is that can actually expand the universe of voters available to conservative voters. And I would submit to you as evidence of that, the divided progressive conservatives and reform had more of the share of the vote together between them than the unified Conservative Party has on average. That they were making separate arguments and they were actually both able to expand their universes. So if I were, you know, arguing for the conservative side, I'd say there's actually some gains to be had in that if you're a rock rib free market or if you're a social conservative, you can have your party, you can make your case. You're going to have to compromise with your coalition partners, but you can at least get out there and get your ideas out there and hope that over time you can persuade people. Sorry, I should have kept that answer much shorter.
All right, my name is Rayal Lavering. I'm from the Ottawa chapter. I want to thank you, Andrew, for this presentation. I think it's one of the most significant presentations we've ever had.
Oh, thank you.
And we're going to study it very, very carefully because our messaging is important. And you've really raised a number of really useful issues. One of them, I've only been with Fair Vote since 2014, so not very long. And one of the lessons I learned is one of the ones that you spoke of today, which is starting at the riding level to explain to people how it works. And also, I used to start with the MMP system as a way of explaining things, and I found it too complicated, and I have found myself as well that explaining to people using STV is way, way easier. They make the transition really fast, and I do it with the pizza analogy. Do you want to go to a party and just have pepperoni? Or do you want to have the option of vegetarian? Do you want to have the option that if you vote vegetarian at the pizza party, you'll actually get a piece of vegetarian? And that's it. That takes what? 6 seconds, and they get it. Right? So I think that's really important, and that's one we have to take on board. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Ted Craig. I'm also in the Ottawa Gatineau chapter. We work a lot, of course, at the grassroots level here at Fair Vote and Lead Now and other organizations, but we really target, I think, a lot of that local effort and outreach and educating people and so on. Now, your advocacy has been so welcome and so admirable on this issue, and of course, we really appreciate it. I find it so frustrating that it seems every time we make some effort and we're rallying people and we're making some progress, and then there are so many pundits in the media, in the popular news, who push back, and it's such a strong pushback. And how do we respond to that? How can we overcome their platform, which in my opinion they abuse, but they have such dominance over whatever their vested interest in, and I know you can't speak for your colleagues, but whatever it is that they want to advocate for the status quo or they're not interested, et.cetera. But how do we push back against that?
Well, I mean, I think you keep doing what you're doing. I mean, I look at the glass being half full, perhaps, that, you know, this is a very radical idea to a lot of people, and it takes time, and it takes patience, and I applaud your organization for being patient. I wish people in politics were more patient. All too often in politics, of course, is if your policy doesn't sell in one election, then you throw it out and you've got a whole bunch of others. And again, where would we be? Where would we ever have had Medicare or free trade if people just, never came back to ideas because they lost on them the first time? But as I said earlier, I actually think the level of discourse and the level of education is rising. I think it's much better than it was. I fully accept your criticism. A lot of my media colleagues are I don't think there's vested interest. I think they're just lazy. I mean, I'm lazy, we're all lazy. But if you, I think it's one of those issues also where people think they know more than they do. They read somewhere something about Israel, and now they know all they need to know about proportional representation. So a little learning is a dangerous thing, and that's one of the things you have to get over is people don't know what they don't know. But patient persuasion I actually think, call me an idealist, but I actually think it works over time. You just have to keep at it.